Hi, I'm Matt Mulvaney from Explorer, and this demonstration is about Apex 5.1 client-side validations. So since using Apex 5.1, you may have noticed a few differences in regards to client-side validation, and this is when you use a combination of the compatibility mode, which is set to 5.1, which is a standard when you create a new Apex 5.1 application, and you use a button where the execute validations is set to yes. So what you may have noticed is that the client-side validations are firing first, and then only if the page is successfully validated will the server-side validations fire. So what are client-side validations? Well, a classic example of this is switching the value required attribute on an item to be yes. When you submit a page via a button, providing that rule is met, you will see that the value required client-side validation is displayed first, and then following entering of a value into that required field, a second validation phase occurs. So this second phase validation will show server validations. So for the user, you can think of this as a two-phased validation process. So if you break this rule and switch the compatibility mode to 5.0, then the full list of validations are all displayed at the same time. However, switching them to a compatibility mode under 5.1 is always going to be undesirable. If you want to remain on compatibility mode 5.1, which is advantageous in many circumstances, but the methods of opting out are not always immediately obvious to the developer. So this two-phased validation approach is causing a point of discussion on the Explorer development department, and various consultants on our department are pro and against this change. So thinking about it as a neutral, on one hand performance is increased by performing client-side validations before the page reaches the server. On the other hand, arguably, the user experience suffers. So for example, if the user forgets to complete a required field, they're informed about this, and the users believe this is the only mistake they've made in completing the form. Following a second submission, they are informed about other validations which, if informed sooner, they could have corrected earlier. So a few weeks ago, John Snyder's created a blog all about Apex client-side validations, which, technically comprehensive, I thought it would benefit from a hands-on demonstration. So rather than to regurgitate all the information from John's blog, I will demonstrate to you some coding examples which are inspired from some of the ideas within John's blog. So I'll walk you through some of the basics of client-side validations and then move on up to some of the more advanced examples. So I'll purposely omit the interactive grid examples, as these are already covered in the sample interactive grid package application and also covered in much more detail on the Explorer Apex 5.1 interactive grid course. Okay, let's start the demonstration. So once I'm logged into this demonstration application, there's a few tabs that I'm going to walk you all through. So the first page is the basic client-side validations. So this is testing this rule, testing the compatibility mode, which is in 5.1, and the execute validations attributes on buttons is set to yes. So I've got two buttons here. One is set to yes, and this button here, which is set to no. So provided this rule is true, that the compatibility mode is set to 5.1 and the execute validations on buttons is set to yes, it will fire and perform these client-side validations. So what I've got here are three fields. The first two are both required. This middle one has a specific data validation message, and this one, although it has the required template, it's not set to required, but it has a server-side not null validation. So if I hit the execute validations button, you'll see I'm informed in this first phase to correct errors before saving. If I say OK to that and fill in the fields here and then submit the page again, you'll see that the client-side validation is passed and the second phase has occurred, which is informing me of this item should also be not null. Submit the page again and it's successful. Okay, so if I reset that and use the execute validations and attributes set to no, then none of the validations are fired, and we bypass both phases, the client-side validation and the server-side. Okay, let's move on to step by step. So in this example, I've got the same three fields, and I'm going to break this submit process down into these various stages. So I've got these three stages here. So the first function I'm going to call is this new function called Apex Page Validate. So it validates or performs those simple validations on the screen. So if I click that, the screen is being validated and it says please fill in this field, and this is a required field. Okay, if I reset that, you'll see from my code here, I'm now going to execute this button here, which is the Apex Message Alert, which also calls Apex Page Validate. So anything that becomes invalid will be set with that inline text in red. And if this returns a false, indicated by the exclamation mark there, it's going to call the new Apex message package and show an alert to say please correct the errors. So this is a sample bit of code which you might find useful in your applications. So if I click that, the validation is fired, it returns a false, and we also see our please correct errors message. Okay, let's reset that. Next I'm going to show you the push and show errors. So the JavaScript that I'm going to run on push of that button is going to be this. So I'm going to initiate an array called errors. This is going to be initially blank. So if you validate the page and it returns a false, I'm going to push into that an array this object with a type of error, a message, and this is a page level message. Once I've pushed the errors into this array, I'm going to call show errors, passing in that array. If there was no errors, I'm going to clear any messages from the screen. You see how this works? Push and show errors. It's validated the screen. Two things have failed. It's known that a validation error has occurred, and I've called the show errors function to show this. Now, whilst that error is still on the screen, let's fill in a few things here and use the button again. This time, although it doesn't submit the page, it is determined that the page is validated and therefore clears all the errors from the screen and closes that message down. Okay, so that's a basic introduction to the client-side validations. Let's move on to basic item validation. So this is where we're going to use this set custom validity function to set a validation message where the item has no data valid message attribute. So this example, this item here has a data valid message attribute, a custom message, and this one has no custom message. So what we're doing here is when the page loads, we're grabbing the validation message from here, and it's returned please fill in this field. We can set this as well. So this is a required field, for example, and we can change the message by using Apex item node set custom validity. Once that's set, we can validate the page again and reset that. See how that works? So various ways, and we can see our custom message there. Okay, we can also call this Apex item get validity, and we're interested in the valid aspect of that. So if we call that, we can see that's currently invalid because we've not entered a value. It says error, please enter a value. Now if we set some value in and validate again, let's reset this first. So it should now be valid, and then we can call that function again. Item is valid. Let's take that away and validate, and then we should see the error. Please fill in this field. Okay, see how that works? The same function when I change the validation message is applied to both this field and this field, although because this field here has got an attribute of this data validation message, it cannot be overwritten. So worth bearing that in mind. So you see here, to validate these items here, I have to type values in and then hit a button to check the item. So this item could submit the page and it would be caught then, or you could have a check button here. So in the next example here is validating the items whenever you lose focus from the items. So it's a very simple example here. So if I click in this item here and then move off, it validates when I lose focus from the item, and the same here, click and move off. So this is a very simple piece of code. This is a snippet of code which I found in the page.js. When you download Apex from ATN, you can open up page.js, and John Snyders refers to this in his blog. So this function is called validate page items on blur. So on blur is on lose focus. So I run this piece of code on execute JavaScript on page load, and it runs through each form element item and applies an on blur function to it, and validates each item and passes the error to an inline item message there. So you see how that works. This applies to all data elements. I suppose you could change and modify this function to pass in a jQuery selector, so it works on certain items, for example. It's worth bearing in mind that this function has lots of comments saying experimental. There's lots of to-dos. There's also a to-do there. It's undocumented. Nevertheless, John makes a reference to it in his blog. Okay, so we talked about this two-phased validation method. So what are the options for opting out of this? Okay, so on this page, on the opt-out page, I've got these three fields again. We know these buttons here. We're familiar from the first page. So if we execute validations, we see that phase one again. If we do use a do not execute validations, then we're bypassing all phases, that phase one and that phase two. Okay, and the next ones are also going to use Apex page submit, and this one is going to use the dynamic action to submit a page. And it's worth bearing in mind that when you call Apex submit directly, the compatibility mode has no effect. So if the compatibility mode has no effect, you're really opting out of those first phase client-side validations. So let's try that now. Let's use submit page. So the compatibility mode has no effect, so we're back onto that all errors on one page, just like in Apex 5.0. If I reset that, you can see similar thing happens with Apex page submit from JavaScript this time. So I've got all my errors on one single page, one single message. And then finally, I'm going to call Apex page submit, but pass in this this object where I'm going to set the validate to be true. So if I do that, I'm back to the to that two-phase process now. I fill in these values in. Okay, get the idea? Let's move on to other types. So the other types of client-side validation, so I introduced to you subtypes and pattern matching. So a text item has subtypes available to it. So I'll demonstrate email and the data valid message. So this is a valid email address. If I was to get this wrong in some way, I put a space in there, move off, I get a standard message that says a part followed by the @ sign should not contain the symbol space, and I can just correct that, or even better, put my full email address in. There's also subtype for URL. So if I get the URL wrong in some way, let's put a dot in there, or even better, a space, and move off. Got please enter a URL. So really this is just checking, and from my investigations, that it starts with a HTTP string. If I was to move that, it's still going to be invalid. Put that back and move off, then we have this valid URL. So this is some example of client-side validation. We've also got pattern matching as well. So on my custom attributes on the advanced section of my item, I've got pattern, then I provide a regular expression and a data valid message, no spaces allowed. So if I type in some words like that, no spaces allowed. If I get rid of the spaces and move off the item, that item is going to be now valid. We've got a number range as well, so here I've got valid values for the valid numbers from 1 to 5. If I push in 7 or 2, you can see it's validating that range. Okay, let's have a look at custom validations. Okay, so this was inspired from John Snyder's blog. Here we have a field to enter a number. So we've got no real clues on what we should type in here. What type of number? Can it be a negative or a decimal place? We know it's a number from here, but it could also accept strings as well. So what happens here is if I type in a number like 3, lose focus, it says an even integer is required. Okay, so I understand now it's an even integer. So if I type in 4 then, move away, it's going to be valid. 8, that works. 10, that works. 11, an even integer is required, so let's fail that time. So what I've got here is 2 pieces of code. I've got a loose focus on this item. So when this fires, I'm going to grab the item, I'm going to grab its value, and I'm going to parse the integer to get this value into n. So I'm going to perform some validation here to check if it's an even number. If it is an even number, I'm going to set the custom validity of the item to be null, else it's failed the item, so I'm going to set the validity to be invalid. Now that's the message. Now you don't actually see that message invalid. It's because it's relying on this data valid message attributes to give it a nice error message there, which is what's happening there. Okay, so following the validation, I want to raise an error based on its validity. So I can say, is that item valid? Well, if it's not valid, I'm going to push into this errors array the validation message. I'm going to use get validation message, which grabs the data valid message attribute. I'm going to place it in line. I could use page, and I'm going to assign it to the item's ID, and then I'm going to show the errors. Now if it was successful in the validation, I want to clear any errors which may be still around, for example that one there. That's why when I put it back to an even integer and move away, those errors are now closed down. Okay, and then I've got a separate piece of code for the before submit JavaScript. So you might see here, if I put a value like 11 is in and submit the page, that was absolutely fine. But I'm going to change this to this item here, execute before validation. So I'm going to switch that on. So what this is doing is first clearing down any errors which may appear on the screen, and then I'm going to perform this item validation. So rather than repeating the code here and pasting it into there, I'm just going to call the focus out event, which effectively runs this piece of code. So the focus out is the lose focus event. And then the same thing at the bottom. If the item is not valid, then I'm going to cancel the submission process, so it doesn't run any further validations or processes, and then I'm going to show the errors, and this time at page level. So let's try that. Let's put in an invalid value and submit the page there, and we see please correct all errors, and that's at page level now. Okay, let's move on to the more advanced section, which is Apex validations. So this is an idea whereby the number which I type in here is not validated through JavaScript, but in fact is run through PL SQL on the server. So you can see here I've got message set from Ajax. So I've got a similar loose focus that we had before. This time, instead of performing the validation, we're going to use Apex server process, and I'm going to call an Ajax process called even number, and you can read more about it here. I'm going to submit into session p8 number. Now the data type is defaulted to JSON, but I'm explicitly putting it there just for this example. So if it was a success, then I want to check the outcome of the return value, which I put in pdata, and specifically have I got a pdata message. Now at this point I'll convert to this side of the code. So this is the Ajax callback. So this is performing a validation, so it's doing a mod on the p8 number, comma 2, which returns any remainder of a mathematical number divided by 2. If it's not 0, then raise an exception here, else, and I'm going to open and close a JSON object, so it's a blank empty JSON object. If there was an exception, I'm still going to open and close it, the JSON object, but I'm going to write in there an element message, even numbers only, message set from Ajax, which is what you see on screen. I'm going to set a location and a page item. So whether the validation was a success or a failure, it's still going to return a JSON object. So I can check if I received an object back and I have got a message, then it must be a fail. So I'm going to set the custom validity to be invalid, and then I'm going to show errors, else it must have been a success, therefore clear any node custom validity and clear any errors from the screen. So that works particularly well there. So let's try an even number, an odd and an even number. Let's try 9. You can see how that works. Okay, so that was a short introduction to client-side validations. Okay, so I'll leave you with the final slide here. This is a screenshot from our website. You can reach us on www.explorer-development.uk.com or reach me on the email address there. And we point you in the direction of our blogs at the top there. So our blogs come out at least once a month. So thank you for your time.